Today I'm sewing a silk dress using Simplicity 8848. This pattern offers a few views including a dress, shirt, and pants. I've chosen view A, the dress. A couple things that I did differently today when working with a silk material: I adjusted the tension on my machine to 1.5 and reduced my stitch length to 2. I also used an ultra glide foot to feed my fabric nicely through the machine, and I used a very fine needle to prevent skip stitches or any puckering in the fabric. The material that I'm using today is a gorgeous flowy silk from Rex Fabrics. It has an adorable fox print, which is what attracted me to the fabric in the first place. You can find this fabric as well as other beautiful materials on their website. I've left a link for you below so you can check it out. So grab that pattern, cut out your fabric, mark your dots and your notches, and let's get started. Apply interfacing to the wrong sides of your right and left front-facing pieces as well as your back-facing piece. At the top of your right and left front dress pieces, you have dashes indicating our pleats. I've marked the tops of these dashes onto my fabric just using notches. Now I'm going to bring the sets of notches together, matching up the notches and allowing that excess fabric to be oriented toward the front of the garment, and then pinning in place. And I'll do the same for the other pleat, bringing those notches together, and then folding that excess fabric toward the center front, and pinning in place along the top. And I'm going to repeat these steps for my other front dress piece. Now that my pleats are pinned in place, I'm going to take them to my sewing machine and baste along the top. Fold one of your tie pieces in half, right sides together. Pin all along the outside raw edge as well as the slanted edge. Take it to your sewing machine and sew the long raw edge, as well as your angled edge with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Leave your short, straight edge open for now. Now I'm going to trim my seam allowance by about half. I'm also going to trim those corners a bit. And then I'm going to turn my tie right side out. And then give that tie a really good press. Repeat all of these steps for your remaining tie piece. At the center fronts of our right and left dress pieces, we have dots indicating where we're going to be placing our ties. Place the short raw edge of your tie right sides together with your front dress piece and pin it in place between those dots. Then take it to your machine and baste it in place using the longest stitch on your machine with about a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Repeat for the remaining tie and the remaining front dress piece. Now place your front and back dress pieces right sides together, matching your shoulder seams and pin in place. And then sew your shoulder seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and finish your seams in your preferred method. I'm going to be using my serger. Place your front and back dress pieces right sides together along your right side seam. Pin your right side seam together, leaving an opening at the dots marked from your pattern piece. Starting from your underarm seam, sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance until you get to your first dot and backstitch to secure. Then start a fresh set of stitches at the dot below that, again backstitching to secure, continuing with a 5/8 inch seam allowance to the bottom of the dress. So here is the opening in my right side seam. I still want to be able to serge the majority of this side seam. I'm going to clip into the seam allowance about a 1/4 inch above the first dot. I'm going to clip to the stitching line but not beyond. I'm also going to clip into the seam allowance the same way, a 1/4 inch below the bottom dot. Now I'm going to take this to my ironing board and press the seam allowance open in this dotted area. Now that I have that area of my seam allowance pressed open, right around that slit opening, I'm going to do a narrow hem around the opening, tucking the raw edge under to the crease that I made with my iron, and doing the same on the other side. Then I'm going to edge stitch close to that folded edge, pivoting at the dot, and edge stitching close to the folded edge on the other side, again pivoting at the dot to meet the stitches that I started with. Now that my right side seam slit is narrow hemmed and complete, I'm going to serge the seam allowance from the underarm seam to the top of the slit, and then from the bottom of the slit to the bottom of the dress. Then place your front and back dress pieces right sides together along your left side seam and pin the entire seam in place. Sew your left side seam from underarm seam to the bottom of the dress with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and then finish your seam. Place your front and back facing pieces right sides together along the shoulder seams, matching your notches and pin in place. Sew your facing shoulder seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press your seams open. I've taken my facing to the ironing board and I've pressed up the outer edges to the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch all the way around. Now we're going to edge stitch close to this raw edge all the way around the facing. Edge stitching that raw edge from the bottom of the facing all the way up and around the neckline and back down the other side to the bottom of the facing once again. Now we're going to place our facing right sides together with our center fronts and the necklines and pin all the way around. Make sure to match your notches and your shoulder seams. Then we can sew the facing all the way around with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, starting at the bottom of the dress all the way up and around the neckline and then back down the other side, down to the bottom of the dress. Then I'm going to trim my seam allowances by half all around the center fronts and the neckline. Then I'm going to open out that facing away from the dress and press my seam allowance toward the facing all the way around, and then we can understitch. We're going to sew the seam allowance to the facing about 1/8 of an inch away from the original stitching line all the way around the facing. Once we have that facing turned to the inside of the garment and we've given it a good press, we can hand tack the edge of the facing to the dress shoulder seam. And then using a needle and thread, you can hand stitch that in place. Matching up the shoulder seam of your facing with the shoulder seam of the dress, you can hand tack the edge of the facing to the seam allowance of the dress so that these stitches will be invisible from the outside of the garment. Do this at both shoulder seams. Now we can start applying our bias tape to our armhole. I'm going to fold back one short edge of my bias tape to the wrong side by about 1/2 of an inch. Now I'm going to place the bias tape right sides together with my armhole so that the short end that I just folded under is at the underarm seam. The raw edge of the binding should be 1/8 of an inch away from the raw edge of the armhole, and pin in place. Continue pinning your bias tape to the armhole so that it's 1/8 of an inch away from the raw edge all the way around. Once your bias tape is back where you started, allow the loose end of the bias tape to overlap the short edge that we pressed under by about 1/2 of an inch and cut off the excess. Pin or clip that loose end on top of the folded edge. Now go to your sewing machine and sew the binding all around the armhole with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then I'm going to trim the seam allowance of my armhole. Then I'm going to understitch. So with the binding opened out away from the dress, I'm going to sew the seam allowance to the binding all the way around, just like we sewed the seam allowance to the facing earlier. Stitching the seam allowance to the binding about 1/8 of an inch away from the original seam line all the way around. Now that that's understitched, I'm going to take the raw edge of my binding, fold it to the seam line, Fold all of that binding material on the seam line so that now the raw edge of the binding is tucked underneath itself, and I'll pin that in place. Continue turning that raw edge of the binding under and clipping along the seam line all the way around the armhole. And then we can take it back to the machine and edge stitch close to that inner folded edge of the bias tape all the way around. And then repeat all those steps on the other side to apply your binding to your other armhole. Along the bottom edges of your dress, you're going to turn the facing so that it's right sides together with the dress. Pin the bottom edge of your facing to the bottom of your dress. Do this on both sides of the center front. Then go to your machine and sew the bottoms of your facings to the bottoms of your dress with a 5/8 inch seam allowance back stitching at both ends. Then we can trim those corners and also trim those seam allowances. And then turn your facings back to the inside of the garment, poking out those corners. The hem allowance for the bottom of the dress is 5/8 of an inch. Press up the lower edge of my dress to the wrong side by 5/8 of an inch all the way across the bottom edge. Because the silk that I'm using doesn't hold a press very well, I've applied 5/8 inch wide fusible stay tape all along the bottom of the dress. This will help me get a more accurate hem here. Take the raw edge of the bottom of your dress and fold it to the crease that you made with your iron, and then fold that on the crease and pin in place all the way across. We're going to sew from one end all the way across to the other end, edge stitching close to this inner fold all the way across. And now your dress is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you check out my other videos for more great sewing inspiration, and I'll see you in the next video.